Hi, I'm Claire Farwell, and my presentation will be about the British Corn Laws. Prior to the implementation of British Corn Laws were the Napoleonic Wars. The wars brought radical changes to Europe, and it was difficult for European monarchs to return their states back to the way they were prior to Napoleon's rule. They found it incredibly difficult to restore what is called pre-revolutionary absolutism, and were forced to retain many of the reforms enacted during the wars. In order to attempt to gain back some control, the British government enacted the Corn Laws. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was not able to import anything from Europe, which led to the expansion of British wheat farming. A very small percentage of Britain's population owned the land. At this time, Parliament was made up almost entirely of rich landowners who wanted to gain more riches locally and were scared that imports would be dangerous competition. They did not consider the rest of the population in their thinking. And when the war came to an end in 1815, farmers and landowners feared that corn prices would drop due to the ability to import it. This fear was not wrong, and the prices did dramatically drop. The Corn Laws were then established to keep the price of corn and bread high. Now, here's some background and clarifying information on the Corn Laws. In this context, corn means all cereal grains, including oats, wheat, barley, and more. It really means any grass cultivated for the edible components of its grain. At the time, tariffs were not at all uncommon, and import had been regulated as early as 1670. And although they were not uncommon, the instance of the British Corn Laws is one of the most infamous ones. The time period during which the Corn Laws were used was between 1815 and 1846. Despite many protests and angry civilians, the Corn Laws lasted for over 30 years. And in short, the Corn Laws can be described as a series of tariffs and other trade restrictions on imported food and corn, with the main objective of the Corn Laws being to keep corn prices high and favor local producers. The Corn Laws also restricted the import of cheap corn by forbidding importation below a set price and imposed steep import taxes. The House of Commons, which was the lower house of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, recommended to exclude foreign-grown corn until the price of domestically grown corn exceeded 80 shillings per quarter. They believed this was a fair price and that it would be dangerous for Britain to rely on imported corn because lower prices would reduce local laborers' wages, and manufacturers would lose out due to the decrease of power of farmers and landowners. Then, in 1816, Britain experienced the year without a summer. This was caused by a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. It caused severe famine and seriously reduced crop yields. Because of this, the ceiling price of 80 shillings a quarter was never even reached. Not many people benefited from the Corn Laws, and many were angered by them throughout the years they were in effect. The people who did benefit from the Corn Laws included nobility and landowners. These landowners were the ones who owned all of the grain farms and were supplying the entire country with overpriced corn. These laws enhanced the profits and political power that came with being a landowner. However, they also made it difficult for anyone who didn't already own land to gain land. The families who originally owned large amounts of land acquired more, and families that did not have any land could not get any. These landowners definitely had a vested interest in the British Corn Laws, as they were the only ones seeing the profits from them. And because only landowners could vote, the British Corn Laws passed with ease. This is despite the fact that landowners made up a very small percentage of the population, with the top 10% of income earners having the ability to vote, while the rest of the population had no say in governmental actions. The majority of Britain's population suffered tremendously from the British Corn Laws. The urban working class experienced a seemingly unending cycle of poverty during these times. This is because they had to spend almost all of their earnings on corn and bread just to survive. Because urban working class families had to spend all of their money on food, they no longer had the extra money to spend on any manufactured goods. This meant that manufacturers no longer needed as many employees and had to lay off hundreds of people to keep their businesses running. The workers that were fired then struggled to find employment because nobody was hiring. This cycle just continued and affected thousands of people. If you have time, I would recommend reading the quote on the right of this slide that discusses this cycle. This quote is from John Bright. One tragic event that occurred during the time of the British Corn Laws was the Peterloo Massacre. It took place on August 16, 1819. In protest of the Corn Laws and the fact that only 11% of adult males were able to vote, a large group of about 60,000 people gathered to demand reform. Reformers sought to bring these large groups of people together in order to force the government to back down from the Corn Laws. Shortly after this rally began, government officials called in the Manchester Yeomanry for backup and to shut it down. The Yeomanry was a militia group of mill owners, tradesmen, and landowners who were very opposed to the idea of political reform and often responded to events of social unrest. When the Yeomanry arrived, they charged into the otherwise peaceful crowd. They, along with the help of the 15th King's Hussars, a British Army regiment, killed somewhere between 9 and 17 people and injured somewhere between 400 and 700 people. This was including women and children. Some historians call this the bloodiest political event in the 19th century on English soil, and it became a huge national scandal. This massacre led the government to impose even tighter restrictions that were aimed at suppressing any meetings for the purpose of radical reform. The Central Agricultural Protection Society was a British pressure group formed in February 1844 under the leadership of the Duke of Richmond. They campaigned in favor of the retention of the Corn Laws. The group decided to form a central office to coordinate various protectionist societies throughout England. These various societies had more influence than the central office, and the farmers were able to exert significant influence locally. 250 farmers from 9 different counties joined the League. These farmers were advocates of policies that shielded the country's agricultural industry from foreign competition. Now, on the other side of the fight was the Anti-Corn Law League. The Anti-Corn Law League was a middle-class, nationwide organization that held many popular rallies supporting the repeal of the Corn Laws. The first Anti-Corn Law Association was set up in 1836, but it did not catch on nationally until 1838. Two of its leaders include Richard Cobden and John Bright, with Cobden as the strategist and Bright as its orator. They were both big supporters of free trade and were part of Parliament. The Anti-Corn Law League was based in Manchester and had support from many industrialists, especially in the textile industry. They borrowed many of the same tactics first used by anti-slavery protesters. Among these tactics were the use of emotionally charged meetings and pamphlets. 9 million pamphlets were distributed by a staff of 800 people in 1843 alone. The Anti-Corn Law League was also used its financial strength to defeat protectionists during elections. They were not always successful because of the tyrannical power of landowners. The League eventually learned to concentrate on elections where there was a good chance of victory. And following the Depression of 1840 to 1842, the League's membership greatly increased. The Anti-Corn Law League succeeded in uniting a substantial majority of all the classes of English society. Prior to the formation of this league, the protests of the Corn Laws were almost non-existent and ineffective. As the years with Corn Laws went on, it was clear that the middle class was beginning to rally together. Many men in Parliament realized this and began to shift their position significantly. They felt that if they didn't repeal it, there would be a violent social revolution. They wanted to avoid this at all costs because they remember what happened during the French Revolution, and Parliament did not want this to happen again in Britain. During the 1840s, Britain's government was under Robert Peel's rule. It did not appear that the conservative-controlled government would change anything about the Corn Laws anytime soon. However, with the failure of the Irish potato crop in 1845, Prime Minister Peel began to reconsider the wisdom of the Corn Laws. This is because of the mass starvation that many countries, including Britain, was experiencing. Peel then recommended the Corn Laws be abolished and that cheap grain from America be imported in to help the starving people. Despite being conservative and having many other conservatives against him, Peel forced the legislation through with the help of the Whigs. He stated that the Corn Laws would be abolished after 3 years of gradually reducing the tariffs. On the third reading of Peel's Bill of Repeal, on May 15, 1846, members of Parliament voted 327 to 229 to repeal the Corn Laws. It was a majority of 98. Then, on June 25th, the Duke of Wellington convinced the House of Lords to pass it. Robert Peel then resigned and contributed the success of the repeal to Richard Cobden. Historians are still not sure why Prime Minister Peel made the seemingly irrational decision to sacrifice his government to repeal the Corn Laws. It is believed that Peel was primarily concerned with preserving the government from political unrest. The repeal reduced the welfare of the top 10% of income earners, the landowners, and increased the welfare of the bottom 90% of income earners, everyone else. Repealing the Corn Laws was in favor of free trade and was a progressive, pro-poor policy. The handful of wealthy landowners did lose money, but the rest of the population was much better off without the Corn Laws. It is clear from the vote that there were many landowners in Parliament that were still against free trade, but the majority was in favor of the repeal. Here are my references. Thank you.